Hi, welcome to the workshop on Poetics of Humor. I'd like to start by reading a poem by James Tate. If you could go to the handout that I've attached with this, to page 4, there's a poem. It looks quite long. It should only take hopefully 2 or 3 minutes to read. It's called The Cowboy. So let me just start with that, and then I can talk about what that does and give a few other examples of humor and how humor can work in poems also. So this is The Cowboy by James Tate. Someone had spread an elaborate rumor about me, that I was in possession of an extraterrestrial being, and I thought I knew who it was. It was Roger Lawson. Roger was a practical joker of the worst sort, and up till now I had not been one of his victims, so I kind of knew my time had come. People parked in front of my house for hours and took pictures. I had to draw all my blinds and only went out when I had to. Then there was a barrage of questions. What did he look like? What do you feed him? How did you capture him? And I simply denied the presence of an extraterrestrial in my house. And, of course, this excited them all the more. The press showed up and started creeping around my yard. It got to be very irritating. More and more came and parked up and down the street. Roger was really working overtime on this one. I had to do something. Finally, I made an announcement. I said, "The little fellow died peacefully in his sleep at 11:02 last night." "Let us see the body," they clamored. "He went up in smoke instantly," I said. "I don't believe you," one of them said. "There is no body in the house, or I would have buried it myself," I said. About half of them got in their cars and drove off. The rest of them kept their vigil, but more solemnly now. I went out and bought some groceries. When I came back about a half hour later, half of them had gone. When I went into the kitchen, I nearly dropped my groceries. There was a nearly transparent fellow with large pink eyes standing about 3 feet tall. "Why did you tell them I was dead? That was a lie," he said. "You speak English," I said. "I listened to the radio. It wasn't very hard to learn. Also, we have television. We get all your channels. I like cowboys, especially John Ford movies. They're the best," he said. "What am I going to do with you?" I said. "Take me to meet a real cowboy. That would make me happy," he said. "I don't know any real cowboys, but maybe we could find one. But people will go crazy if they see you. We'd have press following us everywhere. It would be the story of the century," I said. "I can be invisible. It's not hard for me to do," he said. "I'll think about it. Wyoming or Montana would be our best bet, but we're a long way from there," I said. "Please, I won't cause you any trouble," he said. "It would take some planning," I said. I put the groceries down and started putting them away. I tried not to think of the cosmic meaning of all this. Instead, I treated him like a smart little kid. "Do you have any sarsaparilla?" he said. "No, but I have some orange juice. It's good for you," I said. He drank and made a face. "I'm going to get the maps out," I said. "We'll see how we could get there." When I came back, he was dancing on the kitchen table, a sort of ballet, but very sad. "I have the maps," I said. "We won't need them. I just received word I'm going to die tonight. It's really a joyous occasion, and I hope you'll help me celebrate by watching The Magnificent Seven," he said. I stood there with the maps in my hand. I felt an unbearable sadness come over me. "Why must you die?" I said. "Father decides these things. It is probably my reward for coming here safely and meeting you," he said. "But I was going to take you to meet a real cowboy," I said. "Let's pretend you are my cowboy," he said. Okay, so this is a bit of a weird poem, I know, and it's incredibly narrative, and even to call it a poem is a bit odd, right? It seems to verge on a story. Maybe if I could step back a bit from that poem, and I'll get back to it in a minute. But I just want to talk a little bit about what humor can do in poems, and maybe what humor is. Now, let me start this by saying I was teaching a course one time on oral presentations, and a student came up and gave an oral presentation on what humor was, and put down on this big slide projector a bunch of comic strips and kind of went through them and said, this is funny because this person says this, and then this other person says this, and it was like all the humor was absolutely drained from it. And it's just so painful. It's very painful and counter to the spirit of a poem and of humor itself to try to talk very much about what it is. But I just want to say some basic things about humor. And remember, this is me. This is just my opinion of some poems that I like, some poets that I like, some of my ideas about humor. So this is not necessarily anybody else's idea of humor. And in fact, if you want to write dead serious poems for the rest of your life, that's amazing. Partly why I'm talking about this now, I think, or at least why it's appropriate, is because this is such a serious time, and it's possible, I think, for, like when we're talking about generosity, for humor to be a kind of a revolutionary thing, like a way to cut through all the crap. Like you notice that a lot of the news just seems like nonsense now, at least to me. But some of the satirical shows like John Oliver and Trevor Noah, The Daily Show, and these kind of shows, Seth Meyers, their take on it ends up being a bit more. It's funny, but that's kind of like the humor is a way for us to absorb something deeper that's going on, and that's true, I hope, with poems as well. So let me start with a basic idea of humor. And this is from Hannah Gadsby from Nanette. Now, if you haven't seen this yet, Nanette is, I think it's a Netflix special by Hannah Gadsby, who's an Australian lesbian comic. And this is the performance that kind of sent her into superstardom, and it's really good. And partly, I think, why it's really good is right in the middle of of her show, which is it's like an hour and 20 minutes. She starts talking about comedy and deconstructing comedy and saying she doesn't want to be a comic, and taking the structure of comedy and kind of dissecting it right in front of our eyes, which poems I think can do as well. Sometimes right in the middle of the poem, you can wonder what a poem is and remind the reader that they're reading a poem, and this has a kind of an effect on the mind, which I find quite appealing. So this is like a meta way of looking at it. It's like me saying, I'm making a video right now, and this is a UArts class. It's like a talking about something. So she does that extremely well, and I'm not going to try to say this in a funny way, but let me just touch on the part that I loved from Hannah Gadsby's Nanette. Let me explain to you what a joke is. And when you strip it back to its bare essential components, like its bare minimum, a joke is simply two things. It needs two things to work, a setup and a punchline, and it is essentially a question with a surprise answer, right? But in this context, what a joke is a question that I have artificially inseminated. Tension. I do that. That's my job. I make you all feel tense, and then I make you laugh, and you're like, oh, thanks for that. I was feeling a bit tense. I made you tense. This is an abusive relationship. Do you know why I'm such a funny fucker? Do you? It's because, I've been learning the art of tension diffusion since I was a child. Back then, it wasn't a job. It wasn't even a hobby. It was a survival tactic. I didn't have to invent the tension. I was the tension. And I'm tired of tension. Tension is making me sick. It's time I stopped comedy. I have to quit comedy. So because I'm curious about, I am curious about comedy, but I'm more curious about poetry. So when I hear something like that, I think of the ways that poems are kind of like jokes, and I try to think of the structure of poems, and if poems are structured in a similar way. I think that they're not, in the sense that Hannah Gadsby is setting up an idea of comedy as tension and release. And in another part of her show, she says the release has to come really quickly after the tension. So you build up something that happens, and then you tell the joke, and the joke releases the tension. You start over and over again. But what if you keep adding to the tension? This is what she asks, and then she tells the story about her mother, a long, long story about her mother, and it makes you more and more uncomfortable. And because you're expecting it's a comedy show, you're expecting it to be diffused at some point. You're expecting the tension to be released, but it continually doesn't get released. This is interesting, right? And this is what poems do as well. I feel like poems build tension and build tension, and then there's moments where they diffuse tension. So with a comedy performance, they build tension and they diffuse it usually very quickly. They'll say something happened and you'll care a little bit, and they'll say, oh, but it wasn't really that serious. And this happened, it's not really that serious. This happened, not that serious. They'll kind of keep going back and forth. But what if you don't give the release very quickly? What if you refrain for a little while? So this idea of tension and release, I find really fascinating. Okay, keeping that in mind, let's look at the first couple of poems. This is on page 2. So what I'm going to get you to do here is, this is the first prompt I'm going to ask you to do, is to find a famous poem and then undermine it, like have tongue-in-cheek and rewrite the poem with a kind of poking fun perhaps at the seriousness of the original. So in the case of William Carlos Williams' very famous poem, This Is Just to Say. So let me read this very quickly. I'm sure you all know it, but very, very famous poem. I've eaten the plums that were in the icebox and which you were probably saving for breakfast. Forgive me, they were delicious, so sweet and so cold. So usually the take on this poem is that, oh, what a sweet man. He's stolen something. And it's from Flossie, his wife. He was a doctor in Rutherford, New Jersey, in the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. And I guess they had a good relationship. And, in a relationship, we can steal plums and it's fine. There's nothing very wrong about it. But there is a logic to it, which is, I did this. Aren't I cute? You have to forgive me. And, oh, I enjoyed them so much. So isn't that okay? Which we don't really think about when we look at the poem for the first time. So there's, I don't know if it's an equally famous response, but this guy, Kenneth Koch, who was a little younger than Williams, but dead now. He was one of the New York School of Poets with John Ashbery and Frank O'Hara and others. So he has variations on a theme by William Carlos Williams, poking fun at the logic of the Williams poems. So let me just read these. I chopped down the house that you have been saving to live in next summer. I'm sorry, but it was morning, and I had nothing to do, and its wooden beams were so inviting. So in a way, this is applying the same logic as the Williams poem, right? It's like, I just did it because I felt like it. I was there, so I stole it. And once you kind of ramp up the tension of it somehow, like you make it a bigger subject, like it's a house, then it becomes more serious and you realize that the logic is flawed. Number 2, we laughed at the hollyhocks together, and then I sprayed them with lye. Forgive me, I simply do not know what I am doing. 3, I gave away the money that you had been saving to live on for the next 10 years. The man who asked for it was shabby, and the firm March wind on the porch was so juicy and cold. There he's just poking fun at Williams. Number 4, last evening we went dancing and I broke your leg. Forgive me, I was clumsy and I wanted you here in the wards where I am the doctor. So a little play there on Williams being a doctor. So for this first prompt, find a famous poem and poke fun of it. A lot of poets use a very serious tone, oh, thou nightingale, look at thee standing and I am the Aeolian harp, We take ourselves very seriously as poets. And I feel like we're dying to have somebody poke fun at us. Like it's a lot of this kind of self-serious rhetoric needs to be deconstructed, or at least I think it's funny when it is. And I like poems that are not self-serious, but are have a beautiful, disarming, colloquial voice in them, which kind of sees reality for what it is, hopefully. So, like I used the example in the prompt, Frost stopping by woods on a snowy evening, which begins with whose woods these are. I think I know his house is in the village, though. And, he's standing there and his horse gives a little shake, and it's a beautiful evening. So what if instead of that you said, whose woods are these? Who knows? And then you're really lost. You're in the forest. You're like, whose woods are these? Where am I? Whose horse is this? Anyway, just an idea So take a really self-serious poet. Eliot would be another one. Pound. All those modernists were so serious. So pick one that with an inflated sense of ego. Even Whitman. Make fun of old Whitman. That'd be nice. These people are dying to have somebody make fun of them, I think. Okay, the next one, the next idea, which I'd like to look at, is cliche and idiom. So we're always using cliche. The idea here that I wanted to bring up was that in poems, we're always using cliche and idiom. But often these cliches are the first things that pop in our heads. Like, so if you have something, like you have something in your hand, you say, bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Or take the road less traveled, or don't look a gift horse in the mouth. This is the way that we talk. Often when we're writing, I think the first draft of what we write ends up being the first thing that pops in our head. And for communicating with other people, this is really effective. But we have to communicate fast. So the first thing that pops into our head is not going to be a beautiful poem that everybody wants to reread. So I feel like this is speaking to the value of drafting and drafting again. So I feel like when we first write something, we often say, the cliche version of it. Picture is worth 1,000 words. So I think cliches are interesting. They're okay. And they're fascinating because anything that's vernacular, kind of that we can hear spoken when we're reading it in a poem, carries somehow in a really great way. So I think spoken language really carries incredibly well. But cliches don't, because our language has to be fresh, and cliches are not fresh language. So somebody who plays beautifully with this is Kay Ryan. So I'm going to read one called "Home to Roost." So the cliche: the chickens have come home to roost, right? So this means you've done something, and like you've done something bad. Let's say you cheated on your partner. And then your partner cheats on you. So when your partner cheats back on you, it's like karma, right? It's like because you've done something bad is going to happen to you. So the chickens have come home to roost. And she swears, Kay Ryan swears that she had this written for before 9/11 happened. But a lot of people have said that it's like 9/11 because it's got the a kind of tower-like structure, a weird tower of birds that seems to be crumbling, and the sense of home to roost, as in America was meddling in the Middle East. And, with the Saudis and Osama bin Laden and all these characters and meddling with affairs. And then 9/11 was what happened when the chickens came home to roost. So this is a clever way, I think, of taking a cliche and twisting the language and showing as poets that we're aware that it's a cliche, not doing it unconsciously. Home to roost. The chickens are circling and blotting out the day. The sun is bright, but the chickens are in the way. Yes, the sky is dark with chickens, dense with them. They turn and then they turn again. These are the chickens you let loose one at a time and small, various breeds. Now they have come home to roost, all the same kind, at the same speed. So it's a little dark to think of that as 9/11, isn't it? All these chickens coming back and the kind of violence of it, and the poem itself kind of circling like chickens and being shaped like a tower. So why am I talking about humor with this very dark subject? Well, of course, humor and the darkness are side by side. I think they're extremely close, which is itself a cliche, isn't it? So I would encourage you to take, I think it's funny if we take take a gift horse. Don't look a gift horse in the mouth and just take it. Don't look a gift emu in the mouth. What happens then? Or twist them, Take the language of it and repeat it and play with it a little bit. Don't just repeat it as if as if it were fresh, and it's not fresh. Like, we as poets need to know when our language is fresh and when it isn't. So to me, Hannah Gatsby used the word surprise. So the surprise of this, like the poet knowing what's happening in a poem and surprising fresh language. And these moments of surprise, I think, are an aspect of comedy. Okay, the last one I want to read is connected to the James Tate one. So I read the James Tate already, The Cowboy. So what's going on in that poem? To me, these are Um, well, can I send you to another James Tate poem? My favorite James Tate poem is called It Happens Like This. It's all about this person in a little town who finds a goat, and the goat seems to maybe be Jesus Christ after a little while, which is, I don't know, this poem murders me. It's a kind of dream logic that he uses. So it's a kind of narrative where you feel like you understand what's happening, and then all of a sudden you kind of don't, right? Like in The Cowboy, there's no extraterrestrial, there's no alien, and then all of a sudden there is, and all of a sudden he's dying. And it's like each of these things is a surprise, and I think a delight. And I don't know if it's actually humor, but to me it gets very, very close to humor, the surprise of it. All right, so another one, which I think is funny in the same mode as James Tate, is funny. That is, maybe it's a weirdness with a context. But the context is a dream logic, and you're just slightly locked out of the dream logic. So there's a surprise to it. There's a surprise in the narrative. You're missing some information. So this one I feel like is similar to that. This is Michael Earl Craig. It's called The Helmet. I spun the helmet on the ground and waited for it to stop. When it didn't stop, and probably 2 days had passed, I stood up and began snapping my fingers, just the one hand, my right hand, and I was kind of squatting a little, just bending my knees a bit and tapping my right foot and smiling, I guess, like I was listening to something catchy. And after 2 more days of this finger snapping, and after seeing that the helmet would continue to spin in the driveway, at this point I began to dance backward toward town, down the long dirt road toward the pavement that would take me to the highway and that would eventually take me to town, always dancing and snapping, always moving backward, mile after mile, smiling, really getting down, never looking over my shoulder, falling and getting up, traveling backward toward town, snapping, smiling, really covering some ground. It's a weird poem, right? I like poems like this where, like, maybe the spinning helmet is a metaphor. I mean, it's a helmet, so maybe war never stops, something like that, and you try to walk away from it. But really, the kind of symbolic meaning of it is elusive. It's weird. It's a weird poem. And I like poems myself that remain a little bit elusive. They don't tell you what it is exactly that's happening, but something is happening that involves you. I mean, I like seeing this weird dude kind of like snapping his fingers around this helmet that doesn't stop spinning. It's impossible. And where else could it happen aside from in a poem? So it's the same thing with the Cowboy poem by James Tate. There's a narrative that's kind of involving, and you can't exactly tell what's literally happening. Like there wasn't an alien, and then there was, and it was a practical joke, and then there wasn't, and then he's dying on the table. I mean, is it real? Is it a ghost story? Well, it comes from a book called The Ghost Soldiers. So, I mean, you can think of them as ghosts, but they're not exactly ghosts. It's just a kind of weird thing, which to me is like humor, which certain poems can do in the mind, like a little trick, a kind of impossibility that can be played out in the mind, which I find delightful. Maybe you don't, but for the sake of this exercise, this is the third prompt. So my idea is write a poem that starts, 3 poets walk into a bar. So this is a kind of cliched joke that you know, right? Like a rabbi and a shoe salesman and President Trump walk into a bar, and then they have a weird conversation. So I guess what I mean is write a narrative poem where the ontology, the sense of what being is, what is happening, shifts at a certain point. And if you want to, like, I like the kind of the joke structure of tension and release. Try to write a poem in a narrative structure where there is a sense of tension and release. Write a poem like a joke. Okay? I'm not sure I want to be any more prescriptive than that. I'll just leave that to you. And this is 25 minutes already. So I hope that I have not overly dictated or tried to say that I know anything about humor. These are some poems that I find funny, and these are some thoughts, I think, that I approach humorous poems with. Mostly, I think self-serious poems are a little boring, so I kind of like it when poems have a certain voice which is disarming and seems to be aware of themselves um, as not being too serious, and that there are two sides to the world all the time. There's a kind of balance that goes on. I think there is a darkness and a light. So this is an invitation to let the light and the humor into the poems. Okay, and I'll stop there. I'll post this on the Google Classroom wall. Thanks very much. I look forward to seeing your poems. Have a great day.